a LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of child abuse and family violence. Please listen with care. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. This week, the importance of cyber forensic investigation in tackling family and domestic violence.
Depending on what the victim survivor wants to do, that may lead to a report to law enforcement or some other action.
In our digital world, technology offers both convenience and connection, but it also harbours a darker side, too often becoming a tool for perpetrators of abuse.
If we have identified something, is it safe to remedy that?
Rose MacDonald has made it her life's mission to combat this insidious form of abuse. Her work ensures that the complex process of preserving digital evidence brings these offenders to justice. To begin, Rose tells us exactly what digital forensics involves and why it's a necessary step in almost all forms of criminal investigation, particularly cases involving child exploitation.
Digital forensics historically was referred to as computer forensics. But with modern society, I think the audience could appreciate we've got so many different digital devices now. So we have mobile phones, we have tablets, we have iPads, we have smartwatches. We also have a whole branch of the Internet of Things that people called IoT. So we have fridges in our homes and we have a whole range of different devices that store and transmit data. And so digital forensics is involved with those types of devices that store data and transmit data. And your listeners obviously are aware of forensics, which is in relation to providing or supporting judicial proceedings. So digital forensics is a branch of forensic science that looks at digital data that's either stored or transmitted from devices and uses that in such a way that can be presented in civil or criminal courts.
What sort of cases did you work on in digital forensics with the police?
A whole variety of different cases. So technology crosses all crime types. So we would do work in the fraud space, in the drug and organised crime space, in the child abuse space. So there's really not a crime type that technology isn't part of. Sadly, a lot of digital forensic work with police involves identifying child abuse material and working through with investigators to help identify the material and attribute that back to an offending party.
How does that work for you as a human being, as a caring, compassionate human being, dealing with having to see and view and assess digital evidence like that?
Oh, it's very challenging, as you could appreciate. So I can give you an example of a case, and I think that will resonate with your listeners about how challenging some of this work can be. So I worked on a case where a young man who was in his 20s had committed a variety of offences, all in relation to child sexual assault. There was a warrant that was executed on this particular person and a whole range of different devices from mobile phones, computers and so forth that was seized. And our task was to identify evidence of child abuse. So we started looking at those devices and we found a whole range of different types of offending. So this particular young man had done something which we often refer to as contact offending. So he had abused a very young child in his family. So we had video evidence of that, but the actual perpetrator didn't show his face in that video. So he was identified by a particular body mark. that was a bit unique, and it was on a particular location on his body. And then other forensic processes occurred that were able to verify that mole and body mark was the same as what we found in the video, and we could, through other broader sort of evidence, we could attribute that conduct to this young man. He also produced child abuse materials, so he would get online and use particular streaming technologies to produce and then distribute child abuse material to a broader audience. He also, which was particularly disturbing, he had what we called a vault that was encrypted, which was we couldn't access it because it was encrypted. And that's one of the big challenges of modern day forensics, is the level of encryption. And I'd spent several days trying to access this vault, and eventually I was able to access the material. And what I found was evidence of a whole range of chats with an international chat ring. And this particular person, over a course of several months, had been developing a fantasy where he worked with children. He had identified a child that he was particularly fond of, and his fantasy was to kidnap that child, take that child into a bushland and perform certain sexual acts on that child and then murder the child. And what I was reading was so disturbing. It was almost like I was watching the psychology of this person over the course of months. It started as a fantasy, and then it felt more real. And as I got to the point where I felt like this is becoming imminent, that night I made a phone call to some very senior officers, and he was arrested that night, and he subsequently was put before court. I'm not naming names because we chose never to obviously tell the family that their child was the child that he had a particular interest in. We didn't want to alarm a family that had been a plan that had been fantasized in relation to their child. So I'm not naming the case, but he was put before the court and he was convicted of the contact offending against the family member who was under 5. He was convicted in relation to producing child abuse material, and then I'll call it the fantasy that was spoken about with this international chat ring that informed a lot of the evidence in relation to his mindset. So doing that kind of work, you're exposed to locating the images, looking at the images, finding the videos, looking at the videos, watching the videos, and then reading the material. So that collectively, of course it impacts you. If you're a regular, normal human being, this is behaviour that you will never understand. It's particularly challenging, and over a period of time, it's partly one of the reasons I left police, because I was over looking at that type of material. Fortunately, I had variety in my work. I was doing fraud and drug matters as well, but it's particularly disturbing, and it impacts everybody who's involved in those types of investigations, or on the forensic side, identifying and reporting on that sort of material.
How did that affect you outside work, do you think? If that was one of the contributing factors, how do you think that affected you in your day-to-day life?
I think that's a really good question, because I think when you are in law enforcement, you contain a lot of impacts on you, because you are very focused on following the right procedure. You're very focused on not being emotionally involved, because it's not about you. It's about those people impacted by those crimes, and it's also about gathering evidence objectively to put before a court. So you're very focused on the work that you're doing and the steps that are involved in getting to that outcome. When you leave policing is often when the impact occurs. So when I left police, I definitely had a period of time where I was impacted by the work that I did. And I guess, from a personal perspective, I went through a period of time where I just felt angry for no reason. I wasn't somebody that really expressed a lot of anger, but I could feel myself feeling very irritable. I would see people operating in very normal environments. So I could be walking past a park and I could see somebody pushing a child on a swing, and I would think, is that suspicious or is it normal? So I had to question what was normal again. So over a period of time, I recognised that was the impact on me. So over a period of time, I did some work on that, and fortunately, as I sit here talking to you today, I feel very healthy and quite capable of talking through some of that stuff. But it definitely has an impact. I think it's very important that people recognise that you can't do that sort of work without it impacting you. And I think that recognition and being okay to talk about that is really important.
Can I ask, why was the child and the family not notified?
That's a really good question. And the reason for that is that there was no identifying information about that child that was shared with any third party. So we identified the child through other means, and we were absolutely confident that that child was no longer at risk. So therefore, informing the family about a risk that really wasn't present, we felt disproportionately would cause distress to that family. Of course, if we thought that there was any potential risk to that child, then they would have been informed. But we were absolutely confident that we had done everything that we could to ensure that no details of that child were shared with anybody.
In terms of protecting our own children, it's a major concern with social media, and I'm often floored by how many people post photos of their children in school uniforms, in identifiable places. The dance group, have their logo on their shirts. What are they potentially exposing themselves and their children to?
Again, it's a good question, because I think the research talks a lot about dangers are within family environments and so forth, more so than external. But we can't get away from the fact that there are people in our society who do look for material to post. And when I guess it's just an awareness, be cognizant of the information that you're going to put out online. A lot of social media applications these days do strip metadata, so whilst it's still possible in many instances to find the geolocations of material, sometimes it's stripped, and so that's a good thing that it's not as readily available. But have a look at the images that you're posting. What identifying information is there in that image? And as you rightly point out, if you're in a particular school uniform, if you're posting images that show your car registration or your home address or any other kind of location that will identify your child as going to a particular school or going to a particular place that can be easily identified, just think about that. There's another question also around, when your child grows up, how much exposure they would have wanted on social media as well.
There's no consent.
There's no consent, yeah. So I guess it's the rights of the child to have privacy around the information that's been posted about them as well. So that's another consideration and probably a whole other topic. But I think just being cognizant about what you're posting online and what you're sharing. And of course, we live in this digital age where people are putting lots of information out there, and this isn't certainly to scare people, but I think it's important just to have an awareness.
I know you work with domestic violence as well. This was something that really shocked me, the extent of invasive surveillance of domestic violence victims by the perpetrators. So can you please talk to us about the sort of things that you do to assist in domestic violence cases?
Yeah, sure. So technology facilitated abuse is the term that we tend to refer to, and the prevalence of technology facilitated abuse with victim survivors of domestic violence is extreme. So we work with a lot of domestic violence agencies who are working with victim survivors through their journey. And when they identify potential incidences of technology-facilitated abuse, they come to us. And then what we do is we profile that person in terms of their social media, what devices they own and possess, and also their home environment. And then what we do is we have a look at, for example, their devices, because something like a mobile phone can be compromised in a variety of ways. So a mobile phone can be compromised by a perpetrator adding spyware to that phone, and that can be as simple as downloading a specific application that is designed to spy. It can also be compromised by the use of very legitimate tools. So your audience might be aware, if they work in a corporate environment, they might have a work mobile phone that is part of a mobile device management system. And they would know that they're part of that system because their organisation allows them to put certain apps on the phone or not put certain apps on the phone. They can put their work email on the phone, but that's all managed by their IT department. So perpetrators can use legitimate mobile device management software to control mobile devices as well. So there's a whole range of different ways that devices can be compromised. Many people use functions like family sharing. Family sharing with various members of your family is a really, really common way to keep in touch, know where people are, know that they're safe and so forth. But it can also be used in a nefarious way. And we see a lot of that as well. So that's devices. Then we look at cloud accounts, and most mobile devices are linked to a cloud account. So if you've got an Android phone, for example, you might have a Gmail account, which is linked to a Google cloud environment. And we store data both on the phone, but that gets backed up to a cloud environment. So even if a perpetrator doesn't have access to a physical device, if they breach the cloud environment, then they access every application that sits in that environment, being your emails, your maps, location data, a whole range of stuff that sits in that environment. Same with any other cloud account. I use Google, but there's iCloud, there's all sorts of Microsoft OneDrive, there's all sorts of different applications that people have. So we look at devices, we look at cloud environments, and then there's the home. So there's potential for things like Apple ID tags being put in handbags. I spoke to somebody recently about identifying something with a children's drink bottle. And also there's other mechanisms in houses, of course. People install cameras, listening devices, accessing things like a Google Nest, being able to listen to conversations at home through devices like that. So there's a whole range of different ways that technology can be abused. And that's what we do. We look to identify it. Once we identify it, we preserve what we find, and then we look to rehabilitate so that when it's safe to take those actions, we'll rehabilitate so that the victim survivor can move on with their lives and know with some sort of confidence that they're no longer being tracked or compromised in those ways.
What do you do? Because presumably when you look at that device, the perpetrator is still spying and listening and hearing and seeing what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we manage the device, and I won't say how we do that for methodology reasons, but we manage the device to ensure that we can stop that behaviour for the period of time in which we're evaluating the device. And then we have two pathways. So when we work with victim survivors, many victim survivors go through a pathway which we call digital safety auditing. And that pathway is a consultation that's conducted online, often in the presence of, say, a domestic violence caseworker for support. And during that appointment, what we do is we guide the victim survivor through very specific areas of a device, and we gather information that gives us indications of things that would cause us alarm for further investigation. We also then, we actually sign in with informed consent. We sign in to the various cloud environments, and we share our screen, and we undertake an audit of those cloud environments. And we don't necessarily talk through all the complicated stuff that we do, but we certainly share with the victim survivor and the case manager so that they get some education as well about what we're doing, what we're looking for, And we also provide some education around things that they can do to ensure those environments stay safe. If we find a compromise, all of those things are captured forensically. We use forensic software that allows us to do our work in this environment. So we capture that information, we preserve that information, and then we have a very important conversation around if we have identified something, is it safe to remedy that? So what we always have to be aware of is that if we, for example, identify something and we remove access, then that could alert the perpetrator to the fact that we've taken that step, and that could escalate behaviour. So just because we identify something doesn't necessarily mean we're going to take action to remediate that in the first instance. But we will absolutely preserve it. And then depending on what the victim survivor wants to do, that may lead to a report to law enforcement or a legal advisor or some other action. When it's safe to do so, we then take the steps to remediate that so that the environment becomes safe to use again. So the digital safety auditing is really about identification, preservation, and then making decisions for an appropriate time to remediate. That's different to the pure forensic process. So when we get a device that's for forensics, that's typically to preserve evidence that might go to a criminal or civil court process. And the way that we manage devices in that circumstance is that we take what we call a forensic image of a device. So that would be, say, if it's a mobile phone, we'll take an exact copy of the device. So not just the user information, but the system information. So if you think about a bit-for-bit copy of the device, it's an exact copy of the device. And that gives us a forensic image of the device. And what that does is it means that the actual device itself remains in the state at which we have received it. So we preserve the original state of that device. And then all of our examination and analysis occurs on the forensic image. And that way we can undertake certain examinations and we can locate evidence, preserve it, make comment on it, we can report on it, but everything that we do is on the image of the device. It's actually the device itself that is the evidence in court. That is the exhibit, if you like. The image allows us to undertake all of our analysis and to do our work, but it's actually the image is not actually the evidence. It's actually the device itself. So that brings me to, I guess, a piece of advice to people who might be experiencing, technology-facilitated abuse and want somebody to assist them with that. My recommendation is to always check the qualifications of the person and to ensure that they understand the forensic process in relation to managing digital data. And the reason for that is, sadly, we've seen too many instances where a person has been given poor advice and they'll take their devices to, a repair shop or something like that, and people are very well-meaning, but it may result in the device being factory reset, for example. Well, you've just lost your evidence. And even if the information's been backed up to an external hard drive, for example, well, the forensic process about what's happened to that device has not been adequately documented. And the fact that the state of the device itself that has been changed means you've just lost your exhibit. Because again, I'll go back to being the forensic image is not the evidence, it's actually the device itself. So any change to that device is extremely problematic.
In essence then, if you take your phone or your computer to wherever it is, the Genius Bar of Apple or the equivalent for an Android or a PC, and they do wipe something, in theory then you're giving the perpetrator a defence because that device has been tampered with by someone else.
Well, you're actually losing your evidence. The device that's wiped is no longer a device that's going to be presented at court, and continuity of evidence is very important. And so I think you need to come from the perspective of the person that you're seeking assistance from what is their approach? So if you go to a particular, you mentioned the Genius Bar, for example, they're there to help you overcome technical problems. They're not necessarily coming from the perspective that you might have evidence that might end up in a court proceeding. So it's really about, when you're seeking advice, what's the core function? What's the core function of the organisation or the individual who's offering you that service? And so, my advice would be to always ensure that you are using organisations or individuals that actually have the background to be able to manage that evidence appropriately and also have experience in being able to give evidence in a court proceeding. I mean, that in itself is, as your listeners can appreciate, is a skill.
How much of that behaviour of monitoring is actually criminal?
I guess it comes down to consent. So it's consent and awareness. So if you have consented to somebody else participating in family sharing and you have an awareness that that is occurring and you consent to that, you're okay for that to happen, then that doesn't cross the boundary of being illegal. However, I'll caveat that with, we all know coercive control, and we all, I think, know now with the coercive control laws coming into play in certain states that technology-facilitated abuse is a part of that. Coercive control often places victim survivors in positions where they'll make decisions and they may look to consent to certain behaviour when in actual fact they're not consenting. And if somebody is part of a bigger picture, finding themselves in a domestic violence situation, most domestic violence has an element of coercive control, then it's an important conversation to have with law enforcement. It can be difficult, and these are all to be tested yet, but it can be difficult to, I guess, reach the standard of proof required at law to show consent versus being forced or coerced to do something. But that's where, law enforcement they'll use their professional judgment and so forth and gather evidence around that. And of course, a statement provided by the victim survivor to say that this was occurring against my will or against my consent, even though I allowed it to occur, I didn't consent to it. So they're nuanced arguments, but from our perspective, our role is to be objective and to identify or answer the question, has there been a compromise, yes or no? Can we attribute that to a particular device or a particular person, yes or no? Report on that. And then for the victim survivor and either a legal advisor or domestic violence case manager to provide that information to police to help inform their investigation. So sometimes those bigger pictures are nuanced, but certainly I think we need to educate the community around what constitutes coercive control because consent isn't always obvious.
For example, with the family sharing, I just think this is so common. I know families do it to share photos, but what can you actually access an individual who has access to that family share? What do they have access to?
It depends on your setting, so it can differ, but essentially if you are sharing information with family, location is a big one. You can share particular applications. You can share access to documentation. So there's a whole range of different things that constitute family
Texts,
sharing.
Emails.
Yeah, well, it certainly can be. When we look at compromises of devices and cloud accounts, if anybody in your audience wants to know what's available, the first thing to do is to have a look at their family sharing settings and see what they've consented to, and then go into their cloud environment and have a look at what is available in that cloud environment. So if somebody is connected to their cloud environment, what applications have they got in their cloud environment and what information do those applications hold? That's the stuff that you're sharing.
Why does a perpetrator want access to all of these things? What is the purpose? We assume it's just to monitor, but it can be far more calculated and manipulative than that. So what can they be looking and wanting to do with the information they access?
Perpetrators can gather information for a whole variety of reasons. So stalking, control, gathering information to use against the victim survivor at a later time. We've had examples of perpetrators modifying legal documents and then attempting to use those legal documents in a judicial process against the victim survivor. So modification of documentation, deletion of data, so precious photographs that are saved in a cloud environment, all of the family photographs suddenly gone. So it's really a mechanism to control, monitor and cause harm. And there's a variety of ways that they can do that.
We were speaking earlier and you mentioned actually blocking sites. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. So you can download quite sophisticated spyware and it's designed to do exactly that, monitor, give access to information and to control. So, for example, if a spyware application was downloaded onto a person's device, the last thing that you do when you download this stuff is choose to hide it. So that means that it's no longer visible to the user, but it sits in a discrete area of the system of the phone. But what that can do is it gives the perpetrator complete control of that device, including search history. So we've had examples where a victim survivor was living in a country town and was searching for domestic violence services within that town. Couldn't find any. Had a conversation with us and we said there's many domestic violence services in your region. But what the perpetrator had done is had installed spyware on the phone that blocked any access to any DV services in that area. We can make the police go away. So we can use spyware to actually remove from search results any organisation, any institution that you might be searching for. But it goes further than that. So spyware also will bring up a map and allow a perpetrator to draw a circle around a particular, say, a police station or a DV service or another location where they want to know if the victim survivor has entered. And as soon as they enter that geographical location that the perpetrator has defined, they'll get a text message to say that you've just gone there. So it's very sophisticated. It gives access to emails. It gives access to text messages. It can turn devices that are sitting idling on a phone into a listening device. It's very, very sophisticated software. We actually, we run a research lab, so we purchase this spyware, which we hate doing, but we purchase it for the purpose of understanding it so that we know how to look for it. But as a result of that, we get a lot of mail from various spyware companies. My business partner was actually provided with a Valentine's Day special, Keep Your Partner Safe, for a very sophisticated spyware company, which was just mind-blowing. But what we learned as being part of these mail lists is a particular company was purchasing, at the time, they were brand new iPhone 14s. They were $2,500 each. And what the company was doing was pre-installing spyware so that perpetrators could purchase a phone with all the spyware pre-installed, provide that to the victim survivor, and they would actually have the experience of setting up a brand new phone. And so they would feel that the phone was a brand new phone, but the moment that hit the network, it communicated directly with the perpetrator.
Is there anything that we can do just to do a quick look for ourselves?
Yes, the answer to that is absolutely. So the typical sorts of signs that you might see on a mobile phone, for example, is your battery might drain very quickly. The phone might feel quite hot, so it overheats. You might find applications that you didn't install. So it's good practice to go through your applications and anything that you don't identify to take note of that. There's a decision then that needs to be made about whether or not you remove that application or whether you report that application as part of a broader report to, say, police or domestic violence agencies or your lawyer. And the reason for that is that if that application happened to be spyware and you remove it, you may alert your perpetrator to the fact that that application has disappeared and that control has then been taken away. That can influence the next steps or the behaviour of the perpetrator. So we're never looking to escalate the activities of a perpetrator.
Where on earth does someone go if they think that they are being spied on or there's potentially spyware on their devices? Where on earth do they go? And if they're being financially controlled as well as part of the coercive control, how do they access that support?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we look at the bigger picture. So if somebody is a victim, survivor of domestic violence, there's a whole range of supports that person needs. So accessing a domestic violence service agency is a really good start. And many of the domestic violence service agencies have a whole range of resources that they can then access. So as an example, a number of domestic violence agencies that we work with, if they are working with a victim survivor and they're concerned, then they will reach out to us and make a referral to us, and then we will work with that agency and the victim survivor to manage their issues. So that's a really good place to start, is a domestic violence service centre. It also means that we're putting victim survivors of domestic violence into an entire support network, because this stuff causes so much harm. Technology-facilitated abuse, I think the harm that is the consequence of experiencing that is so pervasive and is so damaging that people feel like they're going crazy.
Well, it's the ultimate gaslighting.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Rose. This has been an absolute pleasure and been so informative. And I just think this is going to help so many people have a better grasp of what their devices can do and can be done to the devices themselves. So anyone who is concerned about domestic violence and affecting their devices, their privacy, their documents, their essential documents, your work is just incredible. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for having me today. And I think the key message is to be aware but not overly alarmed, and just to know that if you are experiencing technology-facilitated abuse, there's a lot of information available and you're not alone, and there's places that you can go to seek advice and get some help.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.